Well, good evening and welcome back, everybody. It's good to have you back here at Bible One. We are on Deuteronomy tonight, so just about halfway through. In fact, when we get done, or about halfway through with tonight's lesson, then we'll be halfway through, because this is week 7 out of 13. And we've got a lot to do tonight. Deuteronomy, like I've told you before, is one of my favorite books of the Bible to cover. And there's lots to discuss there. And I think we'll actually raise some questions for you, too. And at the end, we'll ask you some questions. We'll do our mentee quiz at the very end tonight, so be taking good notes and following along well. I have received some good questions by email this week, and if we get time, we'll deal with some of those too, but probably won't happen tonight. So much stuff to deal with. Just one thing of housekeeping before we get into our notes for tonight, and that is that sometimes you might not be able to locate the videos up on YouTube, especially if you're watching this sometime in the future. So you might want to go to our archives, and you can do that at our website. That's gclancaster.com. And right on the front page right now, we have something that says live stream archives. And if you go to that page, you can find all of the Grace Chapel Bible Institute ones for Bible One, and probably in the future other ones that we'll add as well. And there's also a note up there, or a button that you can push to get to the notes for this class. And not all of them have been posted yet. We're trying to get those up as soon as possible. But hopefully you'll be able to find previous week's notes there, and so you can download them straight from that place on our website. Again, that's at gclancaster.com, and it should be under the live stream archives. All right? Again, if you have any questions on that, don't hesitate to email me, and I'll let you know how best to find those whenever you might be watching this. All right, let's dive right into our notes tonight. We're headed into Deuteronomy, and I wanted to start with something a little bit different with our introduction tonight, and start with a question. Have you ever considered the power of words to create reality? You can conceive of this in terms of a story creating reality, right? Think about even The Lord of the Rings was really popular here just a few years ago. That book has been popular for a very long time. The series of books have been popular for a long time. And so I think a lot of you are familiar with the world of The Lord of the Rings. And you can think about the creatures, the places, the events that you entered into for a time, and they seem to exist for a while. Experiences can even be shared. In fact, there are people who write extra books to add on to that series, or if you like Star Wars, that's certainly the case as well. There are the canonical works, the ones that have gotten the actual official press, and then there are other ones that are written to be alongside, maybe showing you the backstory of a certain character or whatever that might be. And so they're actually creating for us a reality. Right? Some of you might even feel like you live or spend as much time in a place in a biblical, or in a book or a novel's world as you might in the real world. And that is the case even with video games or other things. They can create a reality that otherwise doesn't exist. And a skillful author can even create things like a new language. Think about that with The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien created the language the elves speak, and I know that there are even conventions, and maybe even some of you out there listening tonight know how to speak Elvish. I do not, but I know that there are some who have practiced those things and created those entire worlds. And that's fun. And sometimes you can actually just forget for a time that those places aren't real. And again, I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's dreams there. Those places are not real. They are created by words. We can see that happening in fiction, like I said. The words create a reality. But this actually happens in reality as well. Certainly as we sit here in a Bible class, this will conjure up in your minds Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And how did he do that? He did that with words, right? He spoke and those things came into existence. So it is actually true, literally true, that God can create by the power of his words. And he's delegated some of that to man as well, and he's made it possible for us to create reality with the words that we speak. Think about it in this way. What about a marriage? Marriage vows create the reality that they describe. And pastors often say in a marriage ceremony that the people arrive as two different people, right? The man and the woman arrive as two different people, and then through the words that they say in that ceremony, they become one person. A new reality is created. A marriage that didn't exist before they entered into that building, because of the words that they said, became a new reality. And so that's what a covenant does as well. And that is what we're talking about here in this first part of Scripture. That God spends a lot of time with people creating their reality. First of all, doing it, like we said, literally in Genesis 1, literally creating reality with his words. But then later, creating the institutions that come about through words as well. And these are things like the covenants that we've talked about. So in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, remember we had the Abrahamic covenant, where God came and he spoke to Abraham. He told him to go to a place that he would show him. And then he promised him some things, a land, a nation, and a blessing. All of those were words that God said to Abraham, but they created a new form of reality for him. They were promises that brought something about that would change all of Abraham's future. In fact, the future of the world and our future as well. So think about that too, with how God creates reality with the words that he gives to us. Certainly not only that, but we also have created realities with some of our words. And I have something here, a famous document from American history. In fact, I have the original copy here. It was laying around in the bookstore in the Capitol when I was going through it about 4 years ago. It is a very famous document here. And I have the original. I know Nicolas Cage thinks he has the original, but I stole it from him. And so it's here in my possession. You can see how nicely it is rolled up. And I store it in a very secure place in my office here at the church. And this is the Declaration of Independence. Maybe some of you will know these words by heart, and I'm going to put some of them up on the screen here. And I want you to think about, as I read it, how these words created a new reality, right? That there was a particular part of government, a particular place in the world that the colonies had, and then when they stated these words, it actually changed their reality. It brought about something brand new. And here's the way it starts, and these probably are familiar words to you, and we'll put these up on the screen as well. It says this: when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Okay, so they're even talking about declaring these causes and putting them into words. Here's what's maybe the most famous section of this Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Again, they're saying that the words that the governed give are the consent that forms a government. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Do you see what they're doing? With their very words, they're declaring that something is a reality. And they're separating themselves from a former reality as well, bringing something brand new into existence. And it is all here in this document here, the Declaration of Independence. Think about this from another famous document from the United States. And maybe you can remember which one this is as I put forward these words. Maybe you've memorized these words, you were supposed to in high school or junior high. Let me start with this, and I didn't put this one up on the screen. Just listen to it and think about how these words create the reality that they describe. It says, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So now you know which one it is, right? It's the Constitution. It's the preamble to the Constitution. What follows this preamble are articles and amendments which create the things that they describe. They put into force the laws and the stipulations for how this people is going to govern itself. They are the basis or the principles on which our government exists and operates. You guys, I know even right now in the United States, we're talking about the appointment of a new Supreme Court justice. And that kind of points to, if you're watching this sometime in the future, we're now in October of 2020 here as I teach, and they're wanting to appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court. And one of the things that's always talked about in that kind of time is, how does that person view the Constitution? What is their attitude towards it? You guys, the Constitution for our nation was brought about so that we would know how to govern ourselves for the next who knows how long at that point. It could have been decades, could have been hundreds of years. The point was to make something, a document, which would be so specific that it would be useful, but also so general that it would be able to last for a long period of time. I want you to think about it in this way. Do you think the writers of the Constitution of the United States had any idea that human beings would be able to travel 55 miles per hour in an automobile? Of course not, right? That would have been inaccessible to them at that time. And yet they wrote a Constitution which then later enabled us to come up with the 55 mile per hour speed limit. And again, 65 miles an hour later or 70 miles per hour later, all of those things would have been impossible in the days of the writers of the Constitution of the United States. But they wrote the document in such a way that all laws going forward could be evaluated against the principles of that Constitution. And I want to tell you that this is actually a very close parallel to what we have in the book of Deuteronomy that we're getting here to tonight. They are the basis for law in this country, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They are the basis of law in our society. That is exactly the same thing as what Deuteronomy functions as for its people as well. Deuteronomy is like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in some very important ways. It creates the reality it describes. Now, for Deuteronomy, again, it doesn't have in mind every single thing that could possibly happen in that country going forward, but it gives the principles on which decisions will be made. And actually, more important than that, it is the measuring rod against which all of history from that time forward for Israel will be measured. Okay? This is the standard that they will use to look back and see whether they are living the way that God has decreed that they should live. And so later on, when they have kings, or when they have judges, or when they are taken away even into captivity, what they will evaluate themselves against is how they are living in light of Deuteronomy. And that's why Deuteronomy is such a cornerstone for understanding not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well. In fact, when we get to our New Testament, and I didn't have this in my notes, it wasn't a place that I was planning on going tonight, but you'll notice when Jesus comes along in the New Testament, he's being evaluated by the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And the basis of what they're using is the book of Deuteronomy. They're going to go back to the law, and they're going to evaluate whether Jesus can be who he says he is based on that law. Now, at times, they're going to get that evaluation wrong because they're going to misunderstand the law. And we'll get back to it by the end of tonight, and we'll get back to how Jesus saw and understood himself in light of the law of Deuteronomy and how he was misevaluated by those around him. But for now, you need to know that they were trying to do their job. They were trying to evaluate what was going on in their reality based on what God had revealed to them in the book of Deuteronomy. So it's so important for understanding everything that will come after it. In fact, Deuteronomy is the most quoted book from the Old Testament, both in the Old Testament and into the New Testament. It is that book that Jesus will use as he is tempted by the devil in the wilderness. He's going to quote 3 times from the book of Deuteronomy in order to refute the arguments of the devil there in the wilderness. And so it's something that Jesus saw as central to his life as well. He had it committed to memory, and he would pull it out whenever it was necessary to evaluate what was going on around him. I think that Jesus even came to know something more about who he was as he understood what the Torah, and especially what Deuteronomy said about the nation of Israel and about how it was supposed to govern itself. And so the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution for Israel, it is the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, our Declaration of Independence and, well, to some extent, the Constitution are actually based on some of the principles that we find here as well. So it has had lasting impact on the world from the time that it was written until our time. But no more so than among the people of Israel. They were absolutely dependent on what was said in the book of Deuteronomy for understanding their identity as a nation. Later on in Deuteronomy, we'll see that if a king or a prophet or a nation wanted to know how it was doing, it would have to come back to the book of Deuteronomy to check out how it measured up against this measuring rod of a book. All right? So that's what we're getting into in Deuteronomy. There could be nothing more important for understanding the Old Testament and the New Testament than to understand what's going on in the big picture of Deuteronomy. Let's get into your notes then. I have a blank for you to fill here pretty quickly. There's a quote here from McConville, who did a really great commentary on the book of Deuteronomy. If you're looking for one, he has a really good one. You can look it up. And he says this: "The Deuteronomy in particular explores the way in which the rule of God is expressed in the organization of society." The way that the rule of God is expressed in the organization of a society. And so the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy is to establish the nation, to tell it its purpose, its constitution, its laws, and particularly its unique identity. And when we come to Leviticus and Numbers, you've seen it last couple of weeks as we've been reading through it and teaching on it, that is a central aspect of how God understands Israel and what he requires of them, is that they are to be unique. In another way you could say it would be holy, set apart, distinct, different from the peoples around them, just as God is set apart, unique, and distinct from all of his creation. He's also involved in it, and Israel will be involved in the world around it as well. And so maintaining holiness while being surrounded by a world that is polluted is a very difficult task for the people of Israel. And so they need some specific instructions on how to do that. And Deuteronomy will give them some specific instructions on how to do that. Again, the way that Israel is to live is to be in unique and sharp contrast with the ways in which societies around them were organized. And so everything that's revealed here in Deuteronomy is going to be pretty much brand new to the peoples of Israel. They're never going to seen this in action, never to have seen this in action in Egypt or in the people among whom they're wandering now. They've never seen anything like it in all of the world. And that is God's point with them, is that they are supposed to be unique and distinct from that world that is around them, and even in the way that they are organized. So there are a great many similarities between the founding documents of the United States and the book of Deuteronomy. There are also some key differences, and I want to talk about those briefly here too. The biggest difference, as I see it, is that Deuteronomy was written by God and established a theocracy. A theocracy means that God is the actual ruler of a nation. Not just its theological ideal, but actually its political ruler as well. And when God established Israel, he wanted to be their sovereign. He wanted to be the person who was in control of their government as well as their religion, if you want to look at it that way. And so that's a huge difference between anything that has ever gone on before it. The theocracy is what God has established. Now, any nation on earth can decide to establish itself as a theocracy, and it can say, we are going to have God as our ruler. The difference, however, with Israel is that this is initiated by God himself. It wasn't an ideal created by man. It wasn't a contract from the ground up that says, yes, God, we want you to be our God and to rule over us as our king. It actually came down from him. And so it's one thing for man to ask God to be your king. It's another thing for God to say, I will be your king if you will have me to do that. And that's what happens with Israel. God actually establishes that theocracy. In fact, a very unique theocracy. It doesn't exist anywhere else on earth until the end of Revelation. And so that's a big difference between their society and our society as well. God did not write the Declaration of Independence of the United States or our Constitution. Now, I know that could be somewhat of a controversial idea to some of you, and I know, of course, that God does, in a way, establish all kingdoms and governments on earth. That he has a hand in that nothing happens apart from his will and apart from his action, and yet he doesn't establish them all exactly the same way. The nation of Israel under the Mosaic covenant was established by God in an absolutely unique sense. He personally gave the land to his people, delivered them from Egypt, and brought them through the wilderness into the land that he had promised to their forefathers. It is his land, and he will stress that over and over again in Deuteronomy, and he gives it to whom he chooses, and he has the absolute right to direct how they will act in it. This is not a contract among equals, and that's what actually our Constitution says, right, is that we as equals are coming together to form a government. That's not at all what's happening in the book of Deuteronomy. God does not see himself as an equal, certainly not with an equal vote among the people of Israel who is governing. He is the absolute sovereign. There is nobody who rivals him in power or ability. And so this is a covenant established, written, and enforced by the Creator King with his chosen people. And again, that is unique and different than any other nation on earth ever was or ever will be until Christ comes to establish that kind of kingdom on earth again. Okay? All right, let's talk about some technical details then of this book. We'll start with the author. And just as we have said with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, the author of this book is Moses. He wrote all 5 of these books, actually, the Pentateuch as one book, and we've seen that through these weeks that we have come in contact with the Pentateuch. It was all one book at one point. There was no separation of these different things, and even the word that gives its name as the title for this, Deuteronomy, it comes from the Greek. And I think I'd mentioned it last week or the week before. The Greek language wasn't even in existence when Moses wrote this book, so there's no way he would have called this book Deuteronomy. That is not an original title to this book, and actually I think it reflects a bit of an understanding that is false about this book. Deuteronomos in Greek literally means second law, and this is not a second law. This is a second giving of the first law. It's a reiteration of the first law. And so I don't think this is something that Moses ever would have called this book. He certainly didn't think of this as any kind of second law. It is a second giving of the first law. And let me just tell you a little bit about the circumstances that bring about that second giving. Okay, we have already seen that the 10 Commandments were listed for us in Numbers, right? And as you were reading through this week, you saw the 10 Commandments listed there. We're going to find them again as we get into Deuteronomy this week, and so we wonder, why are they stated twice? And I want to tell you basically how that happens. And so Numbers is written earlier as the people are coming down from Sinai, and it talks about the first generation of Israelites who are wandering around in the wilderness, right? They come across the entrance, the potential entrance into Kadesh Barnea, into the Promised Land, and they initially refuse to go in, and then God punishes them by saying, okay, if you don't want to go into the land, then you're not going to go into the land. You're going to wander around out here for 40 years until this whole generation dies off. You remember that instance there? And so that first generation was the ones who originally received the law at Mount Sinai. And now we have those 40 years later, or about 37 and a half years later, actually, as they're wandering and almost to come into the Promised Land. That's when Deuteronomy comes to be. Moses, I think, writes this very late in that wandering period, just as they're about to enter into the Promised Land, and they're standing just on the verge of the Jordan River, looking across into what will be the Promised Land that they're going to go in and conquer. And so Moses now gives the new generation a recap of the law. He tells them and lays it out for them very much as he had earlier, but with a little bit more detail and a little bit more, actually, emotion as well. And so this book of Deuteronomy really functions as 5 sermons that Moses is going to give to the people of Israel before his death. And not only that, but he knows he's about to die. And he knows that they've never had another leader other than him. Every one of those who is now living in the wilderness with him was born in that generation since they had left Egypt, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. Okay, so all of them have only known Moses as their leader. And so he has a very complicated relationship with them, for sure. They have driven him crazy at times. They have exhausted his patience at times. And yet he still feels like a father, like a shepherd towards them. And so he takes it very seriously when he knows he's about to pass from the scene, that he wants to pass them off into good hands. And he wants to give them very detailed instructions on how they're supposed to live as they enter into the Promised Land. And so certainly these are God-given words through Moses, but you'll hear a lot of Moses' voice in it as well. And you'll hear the tone of Moses' heart, and even where it matches the tone of God's heart for his people as they're about to enter into this land. He is desperately fond of them. And he wants them to be successful in the land that he is not able to lead them into personally. He knows that God will go with them. He knows that God will provide new leadership for them. And so he hands this off to them and with a new generation with specific instructions about how they're supposed to conduct themselves in the land. And as you read through Deuteronomy this week, I'd ask you to pay close attention to those words. That phrase occurs many, many times in the book of Deuteronomy. And it is very important, the phrase "in the land," because God is actually showing them how they are supposed to conduct themselves in the land. And I think he is very specific about that. He doesn't really have in mind what it would be like for Jews living outside of the Promised Land. Like if they're taken into captivity, if they're taken out of the Promised Land, if they decide even to move out of the Promised Land on their own, the same rules and the same principles don't necessarily apply to them in the same way. You see, Deuteronomy is all about context. And we talked about that last week a little bit too, right? We talked about the 3 laws of real estate being location, location, location. It's the same for hermeneutics and for understanding Deuteronomy. We want to understand context, context, context. And so when we read how they're supposed to put these laws into practice in the land, we should understand that there is a context for the application of these laws, that they don't always apply in exactly the same way when the people are not living in God's land. Does that make sense to you? I hope that you will see it as you read through Deuteronomy, that God is specific about when he tells them or how he tells them to conduct themselves in the land that they are going in to take possession of. All right, so let's get back to author. Okay, we talked about Deuteronomy not being the original title for this. Again, a Greek title that comes along much later in the translation of this book into Greek, about 200 years before Christ. In Hebrew, the title, if you were to give it a title, and I don't think it probably even originally had a title, but what the Hebrew Bible would normally use right now for a title for that would be Ela Hadavarim, and that means these are the words. Those are the very first words of the book of Deuteronomy, and so that's how the book is called or referred to. And actually, those are very insightful words as a title for this book. You might think these are the words, doesn't have much to say about the contents of the book, but it actually does. These are the words that are going to govern the lives of these people. These are the words that they're going to measure themselves by from generation to generation. These are the words that are establishing them as a new nation in a new place under new ownership, actually, under God's leadership as well. Okay, so these words are centrally important to them, and I think these are the words would be a fitting title. If you want to scratch out Deuteronomy in your Bible and put these are the words as the title, that might be a worthy thing to do, but then you're going to get confused when somebody tells you to turn to the book of Deuteronomy. You're going to have that scratched out in your Bible. So we talked about author. Let's talk about the setting. And actually, I want to talk about setting in a number of different ways. Okay, so we want to approach setting from a number of different angles as we come to this book. And back in hermeneutics, we talked about the fact that when we think about setting, we don't want to talk about just time and place, because there's so much more that's going on that determines the context of something than just the time and the place where it happens. Okay, so let's talk about setting according to a number of different angles. And I think I've got this on our, okay. Eventually, we're going to get to the Mosaic Covenant. Maybe we should back up a second and start that out and kind of understand what that's talking about as well. So before we get into setting, let me talk with you really quickly about what the Mosaic Covenant is about, okay? So you'll remember we talked about the Abrahamic Covenant, right? We found it in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And it talked about a land, a nation, and a blessing. And in particular, it talked about a blessing. And it really pointed the people to the fact and emphasized for Abraham and for his descendants the fact that they were going to be a blessing, that there would be people who would bless them, people who would curse them, but ultimately they would be a blessing to all of the family groups, all of the nations, all of the peoples of the world. And so really what that covenant points them to is their relationship with everybody else in the world, all of their nations and peoples, everyone on earth. Okay? And so the Abrahamic covenant is actually a very broad covenant. It's not very specific. It doesn't tell them exactly where or how many people are going to be involved. And it doesn't tell them a lot about their future. Now, there's more detail added to it in Genesis 17 and other places. Things like they'll be as numerous as the sand on the seashore and as numerous as the stars in the sky. But it doesn't get into a lot of specifics about what that means in terms of their day-to-day walk with God. It's kind of a big picture kind of covenant. And it certainly stretches out through the ages and includes, like I said, the entire world under it. And so I want you to think about the Abrahamic covenant as extremely broad. And it's God's big picture plan for what will happen on earth from that point forward. And it's actually that has its culmination in the New Covenant when we get to the New Testament. It's talked about in the Old Testament, but eventually brought into bear in the New Testament as well. Okay, so that's what I want you to think about, is as Abrahamic covenant being the broad and all-encompassing covenant. When we get to the Mosaic covenant, and that's really what's spelled out for us in the book of Deuteronomy, Mosaic meaning not little pieces of things put together, but from Moses, or written by Moses, or according to Moses. We're really thinking about the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy at that point, and Leviticus to some extent as well. And this is a much more specific covenant than the Abrahamic covenant. Again, it's how people are supposed to live their lives in the promised land, and how they're supposed to treat one another there, and how they're supposed to interact even with foreigners while they're there. It's going to give some very specific instructions on what a prophet can do, what a king can do, what a priest can do, and it's going to give a lot of guidelines according to those. It's also going to give some general things that all people should use in their interactions with others, some very big picture principles, things like do not murder, which, by the way, doesn't come into existence as a law just in the book of Deuteronomy, nor in Numbers. But we see that all the way back in Genesis chapter 3 and 4, right? God certainly never said that murdering another human being was lawful. Right? That has always been against his plan in terms of his law, okay? And so there are principles, timeless principles, that are set down in stone in the book of Deuteronomy. They're things that have always been according to God's plan, and most people have understood them to be that way. And they're general principles. And we can really see those things like what we see in the Ten Commandments, right? Do not murder, do not commit adultery, those kinds of things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind is how it's put as its broadest principle, right? And love your neighbor as yourself, another broad principle of that covenant. Okay, those are things that are all-encompassing, that are applicable to all the world at all times. But there's much in the Deuteronomic covenant, in the Mosaic covenant, that is specifically applicable only to Israel. And we'll talk about how to understand the difference of that coming up in a little bit. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with the Mosaic covenant. It's what we're seeing here in the book of Deuteronomy. It is certainly a part of the Abrahamic covenant, but it's a specific and narrow part of that covenant. It doesn't apply to everyone on earth exactly the same way. All right, let's get back to the settings of the book, and I want to talk about it in a number of different ways from a number of different angles. So first of all, the historical setting. And for historical setting, what I want to do is take our minds to the author and what he says about the setting. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 10, it says that the people are, in fact, as numerous as the stars of heaven. In fact, if you have your Bibles, please do turn to Deuteronomy. We will be referring to it quite a bit tonight. We'll be reading some large sections if we have time for that tonight. I really want to get a lot in, so let's see if we can speak fast enough and hear fast enough to get quite a bit covered. The great advantage you guys have is that you can go back and rewind and sort through some of these things if you need to, or even take a break if you need to. Press the pause button and come back later. If you do that, though, you might be a little bit off when we come to our Menti quiz later on. So maybe then you're second listening. But Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 10 says this: "The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven." And as Moses writes those words, I wonder if he has kind of some mixed feelings about that, right? Have you ever tried to shepherd as many people as the stars of the heavens? It certainly was an overwhelming task for Moses, and there are times when that was, he certainly said that to God too. I am not able, in fact, he says that here in verse 12. "How can I bear by myself the weight and burden of you and your strife?" Right? So they are both a blessing and a bit of consternation to Moses. But that also points out to the fact that part of the Abrahamic covenant has already been fulfilled even before they enter into the promised land. And that is, they are as numerous as the stars of heaven. They have been a great nation, even if they're a nation without a land. They have never, though, to this point, been self-governing. Think about that. Remember, we talked about it last week. They had been nomads or semi-nomads under the time of the patriarchs. And then for the last 430 years plus, they have been either slaves in Egypt or, again, nomads wandering in the wilderness, waiting to have their own place to call home. And so they've never had an opportunity to govern themselves before. isn't it a tremendous gift that God gives them a way to govern themselves, that he gives them a standard by which to do that? Okay, so that's kind of the historical setting. Let's go to the geographical setting then. I didn't put a map in my notes to stick up on on a slide for you tonight, but hopefully you can see this map behind me. I'm going to walk back to it even right now. And it won't be in great focus for you, but what you can see is this is the land of Israel here, the Mediterranean right here, the Dead Sea here, the Sea of Galilee up here, okay? And so for this 40 years, they've been wandering around basically out here around the outskirts. They've walked up through Edom and Moab, and now they are poised right here on these cliffs. And if you were able to see it here in person, you could see this is a bit of a relief map. And you can see that this side over here of the Jordan Valley is much higher than what is below here, okay? So this whole Rift Valley here. So this is where they're poised, right on this side of the Jordan River, looking over, and they can see Jericho opposite themselves in the Promised Land. So this is all that's going to be in their possession, but now they haven't even set foot in there, and they're looking from over on this side as they're about to enter into it. Okay, so that's kind of the geographical setting, and you can, from there, you get, like I said, you can get a really great viewpoint for what they're about to enter into, and they're on the east side of the Jordan, waiting to head west into the Promised Land there. Okay, so that's the geographical setting. Let's talk a little bit about the political setting. Now, this is something that they haven't encountered much. They're now going to be a people doing some conquest and having their own political party, political actions and activities. And so God has given them just a little bit of a taste of what warfare looks like. So some land on the east side of that Jordan River has already been conquered from Sihon and Og, but this is not part of the Promised Land and won't be fully under Israelite government until all the borders of the land across the Jordan are secured. Now, there are going to be two tribes that have possession on that side of the Jordan River, but really, most of the territory and everything that's going to be historically theirs is going to be on the other side of the Jordan River. So Israel has no real experience at self-government in its own land, but that's all about to change. And so government is a key facet of what's going to go on in this book. The next kind of setting then is the economic setting. Okay, the economic setting. Things are about to change economically greatly for them as well. The people will be going from daily manna provision, bread literally falling out of the ground that they can pick up and eat every day. That's no longer going to be a reality when they enter into the Promised Land. But they will also inherit some very important starting ground for their future economic prosperity. And so God gives very specific instructions about how they're to go about the conquest so that things like vineyards and orchards will not be destroyed. And God says, do not tear down those fruit trees and use them for fuel or for siege works or any of those kinds of things. And don't destroy the vineyards because those take a long time to come back and be fruitful again. And so God wants to give them a land that is already prosperous. And so the way they go about conquering that land, the way that God will enable them to do that, really makes it so that they can be economically prosperous from that point going forward. Again, think about it. If they come in and they lay waste to all this land, then they're going to have no means of sustaining themselves for the early years as they're in that Promised Land. And God wants them to have success even early on. And so he gives them crops, vineyards, even houses. He tells them not to destroy most cities. There are only 3 places that he says specifically they're supposed to destroy by fire. The rest of them, the people will come out to them in battle, and they will conquer them out in the fields and in the valleys, and then they'll be able to walk into these cities where these houses are already pre-made for them and occupy them. Now, they will do, obviously, their own building and establish some new cities and do some remodeling in some of these places. We've seen that actually in archaeology in the last several decades, is that the Israelites built distinctive kinds of houses that were different than the Canaanites had before them. Not enough time to talk about that tonight. Maybe when we're in Israel, we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit more. But these places will all have to be maintained, and they'll have no idea how to do it. They haven't been farmers. They haven't been getting orchards, producing the crops there. They don't know the rhythm of the seasons that will take place in Israel. And in fact, we're going to get to it a little bit later. But one of those phrases you will see over and over again in the book of Deuteronomy is that he is giving them a land filled with milk and honey. And I'm going to read a passage to you here in just a little bit. Probably spoil that with what I say here somewhat as well. But in Egypt, the economic situation was totally different. In Egypt, all of the crops are dependent on the flooding of the Nile River. And this happens seasonally, and it spreads silt out over the plain, and then crops are able to grow, and then you can both use the water that's there, but also create canals that bring water to water your flocks and your herds and your crops as well. That would not be the case in Israel. There are no major rivers except the Jordan, and that's not even that accessible for most of the land. And so they're heavily dependent on the rainy season. And when that rain falls and how it falls and how much of it falls greatly determines how successful they will be in raising their crops and their herds. And so I just want to talk about it quickly with you, but think about what produces honey, right? So it's a land flowing with milk and honey. Let's talk about that honey part first. What is it that produces honey? It is, of course, the bees, right? This, again, was something that was not common in Egypt. There wasn't a lot of pollination going on for those crops. They were crops that were dependent on the seasonal flooding of the river, but not as much on the pollination that goes on with bees in the vineyards and in the orchards. Okay, I don't know if you've ever driven out of here to the coast, the west coast here, all the way to through Ventura and then to the coast. That's where we go, all the way to Ventura. And when we drive through, oftentimes there are those vineyards and the orchards that are there, and you see even stacks of bees piled up there, waiting to do their job in those places. And so we really here in California can picture the importance of bees in bringing about those crops. That's exactly the same kind of climate that they have there. Okay, so there's rain, there's dew that comes in the evening times in the high country there, in the hill country as well, that waters those crops all during the year. That is something that was totally different than what they experienced in Egypt for 430 years. Okay, so that's the bees. They're there to take care of the vineyards and the orchards. What about the milk, though? Now, normally we would think about milk as coming from cows. But that's not how the Israelites would think about it. They would think about it as coming from goats, because goat's milk was the more popular and the more available there in Israel. And so the goats really are talking about, when we talk about the milk, we're talking about those flocks of goats that would be shepherded around the hills in Israel. Again, something that was not normal in Egypt. There were shepherds in Egypt, but the kind of shepherding that would be done there would be much different than would be done in the land of Israel. And so God's giving them a land that they're not used to, which means he needs to tell them how best to be successful there. How do they take care of these things? And how do they be prepared for that? And so that's what the book of Deuteronomy is about for them. Let's talk then about the theological. Okay, that was the economic setting. What about the theological setting of this book? The wilderness wanderings have been a significant test of faith and of God's patience as well. There's definitely been some generational lapsing in terms of obedience. Many, as we will see in the book of Deuteronomy and again in Joshua, have not been circumcised in this time that they've been wandering in the wilderness. There's a very real sense that this generation must ratify the covenant that God has made with them through their fathers who have now passed from the scene. Okay, so grandma and grandpa and mom and dad have passed away. The way that they interacted with God is now going to be different than the way that we are going to interact with God. And so that's what they're looking forward to. They're going to come into the promised land. They're going to be conformed again to the circumcision of that covenant. And they're also going to start to celebrate the feast that God has ordained, starting with the first Passover when they enter into the promised land. So God needs to give them instructions on how to do those kinds of things as well. What are the festivals that will govern the seasons of life? And what's interesting about those festivals, too, as you were reading in Leviticus and Numbers, is that those festivals come at specific key times in the economic life of Israel as well. They're times to gather around the harvest. Okay, so right after the harvest begins, and then right after the harvest ends, that's when these festivals take place. And they establish a rhythm of life within the promised land. They also establish a community of people. These people have to come together over and over again from all these different diverse places and share in their experience and their worship of God in the temple. And so God has ordained that as a way of bringing unity to his people as they're in the promised land. And so he tells them about these festivals. He tells them how to do them, gives them instructions on how to do them, and partly so that they can relax while they're actually there and just enjoy those festivals together. They'll know what to do and how to do it. It's been well prescribed for them, so they don't have to invent things, so that they don't have to guess at what God will want, but that they can relax and perform those things that they are asked to do in a way that is a rhythm of life, something that they will do year after year after year, and they'll hand it down from generation to generation. A father will teach his son, and a mother her daughter, exactly how to worship God in the way that he has prescribed. Okay? And so there are some real questions that are on everybody's mind as they're standing across the river looking into the promised land. The question on everyone's mind for sure will be, what will happen when we set foot in the promised land? Will God be faithful? We know that he will, because he's been faithful in all of their history. The bigger question, though, is, will the people be faithful? And what will happen if they are not? And so Deuteronomy describes what will happen when they are unfaithful. Ultimately, the punishment for unfaithfulness is expulsion from the land. They're going to be taken out and removed and put into exile among peoples that they don't know. But there are little ways along the way where they can make sure that that's not going to happen, or at least make up for some of the things that have come about to separate them from God. And so God describes all of those kinds of sacrifices that will make it possible for man to have relationship restored with God once sin comes into the picture. And so it's an inevitability that there will be sin, that there will be breaking of that covenant, that there will be unfaithfulness of the people. And so God tells them what to do when that unfaithfulness has taken place, how they are supposed to come back to right relationship with him through atonement, especially through the Day of Atonement. And that will be a central part for them. There's one specific day when every sin that was either forgotten about or wasn't even known, an unknown or accidental sin, or even those sins that were created on purpose but were never satisfied or atoned for, that will all happen on that Day of Atonement. It will be the covering for all of the people at once. Okay, so that's all parts of the setting there, political, economic, theological. But the most important one that I want to draw your attention to right now is the emotional setting. Again, picture yourself as you're about to enter into this promised land. You've had only one world leader. He's the only one you've known as you grew up. He's the one who brings stability. He's the one who brings just the day-to-day sameness for you, that has that you can always rely on him. And now he's about to die. There will be new leadership. There's excitement about finally getting to the promised land, and yet some fear about how it will go. You guys, change always brings fear. And this is about to be a major change for the people of Israel. Right? All of that uncertainty, all of that anxiousness, they're about to see what's going to happen. And so there's a lot of fear that the people have to deal with. And one of Moses' points to them is going to be, do not be afraid. Why? Not because of your own ability to deal with what you're coming across, but because God goes there before you, and he goes there with you. Okay? And he will be your God in that land if you will turn to him. And so there's a lot of emotion. Like I said, sadness, there's some joy, right? It's about to, everything that we've waited for and planned for the last 40 years is about to come to fruition. And there's just an amazing sense of the land that God is giving to them is a good land. And so there's a lot of joy there too, mixed in with all those other emotions. So it's highly emotional. And you'll see in the book of Deuteronomy, if you read carefully, that God is emotional about it as well. That God is dealing with the emotions of the people, and he is sharing with them the emotions that he has at the same time. All right, so those are the settings. Do we have any questions yet? Okay, not seeing any questions. Any come through YouTube or anything? Okay. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to email us, bhayen@gclancaster.com. You can always use live@gclancaster.com as well for your questions. And we will try to get to those either on the spot tonight, or I'll try to answer them by email if I get to later on. All right? Let's now talk about structure. We're going to change our tack just a little bit and start to talk about structure. Wow, we've already gone 45 minutes. We're already halfway through. All right, I'm going to have to talk faster. You're going to have to listen faster. I want to introduce to you a very important aspect of structure for this book. And this is something that really wasn't discovered or rediscovered until recently, about 150 years ago or so. And actually, the way it came about was some new documents were found through archaeology in central and southern Turkey, in a land that was once occupied by the Hittites. Now, you might have remembered the Hittites from reading through your Bible, that they're one of the ites, right, that are part of the people in the land that Joshua and others are supposed to take out of there, the Canaanites. Well, the Hittites are actually a very strong empire that are up to the north of Israel. And now they have some smaller kind of outposts in the Promised Land in Canaan. But really, their economic center, the political center, was up there in the north in what is modern-day Turkey. And what was found in the last 150 years or so was a series of documents that were written during the same time as what we have here in Deuteronomy. So in the early Bronze, late Bronze, or early to Middle Bronze Age. Or actually, let me back up. It's Middle to Late Bronze Age, okay, is what we're talking about here now. Remember, Middle Bronze is the time of Abraham. And so now we're on the verge of the Late Bronze Age. And the early Iron Age will be the time of the kings. The Late Bronze Age is really the time of Joshua. Okay, so we're getting close to that Late Bronze Age. And so these Hittite documents that were found from the same amount of time were what were called vassal treaties, or suzerain vassal treaties. And I didn't put it in your notes, but the suzerain is spelled this way, Suzerain. Again, Suzerain. Okay? And so these are called suzerain vassal treaties. And I put vassal in your notes. It's under structure there. And it's a relationship between two different parties. The suzerain is really the empire. It's the overlords who are watching over a lot of different smaller territories. And the way that government was done in this time was that when a kingdom conquered another kingdom, especially when an empire conquered a smaller kingdom, what they would do is they would allow that people to kind of govern themselves within the land. That they would have a great deal of autonomy there. And really what that suzerain was after, the empire, what they were after was tribute. That each year, that smaller kingdom would take a part of the crops that they grew and some of the animals that they raised, and they would give them back to the empire. And this would be a form of taxation for them. And so they really wanted their vassals to be successful. And so they didn't want to completely wipe them out or destroy all of their ability to make money, because then they wouldn't have enough money to pay taxes. Well, it wasn't really money. It was more in terms of goods that they would give to them. I hope that's making some sense to you. Okay? And so what would happen is that empire would come in, they would conquer that smaller kingdom, and then they would make with that smaller kingdom a treaty or a covenant or a contract. Okay? Think about it that way. And they would say, okay, this is what we have done for you. We will take care of you. We will make sure that none of the other empires come and they take you over. We'll make sure that your roads are well kept, that you don't have chaos, that you're relatively secure, that you can trade with other people as well, particularly with us. And we'll make sure that you are safe and secure in your place. But in return, what you're going to do is give us taxes each year. It's a little bit how mob rackets work as well, right? The bully comes and he says, hey, we were afraid that other bullies are going to beat you up. And so, but really, the bully you have to fear the most is me, okay? So what I'll make sure happens is that you don't get beat up by me, and then you give me all of your lunch money, okay? That's kind of how it works, and that's what's going on here with the suzerain vassal treaty as well. The empire is saying to its vassals, let's write a contract so that everybody knows what we can expect from this day forward. And what they found with these Hittite suzerain vassal treaties is they all followed a particular format. And this was the format that they found. It's a 6-part treaty, and I put that in your notes. And first of all, there's a preamble. And the preamble is kind of like what we've seen in stories that we've talked about in narrative, where it talks about the places and the people who are involved. Okay, so it gives you the setting, the characters, and a bit of the plot. And that's what happens in the preamble. It says who is involved. Okay, so the empire, the Hittites, the vassal. Let's say at this point it's the Jebusites. Okay, and so it names who these parties are, and then talks about the relationship with one another. Who is king and who is vassal, and defines all of those things for us. Okay. The number 2 thing is the historical prologue. And really the purpose of this, and it could be pages long, it could be paragraphs long, it could be only a couple of sentences. But what it does is it talks about how did we get here? What brought us to this point? And with this kind of treaty, again, if you're talking about an empire conquering a smaller kingdom, what it would generally say is, hey, we came and we conquered you, and it was, it was expensive for us. It was a kind of a hassle for us to have to do that. We had to come all the way from our own place and come down to your place, and it took us a lot of time, and we lost some resources along the way, but we conquered you. And so you are now helpless unless we take care of you. And that's kind of the historical prologue. Talks about the stages in that relationship. And then it talks about some general stipulations. And these might be things like, we will take care of you in these certain ways, okay? Economically, politically, militarily, we'll take care of you, okay? And you will give to us everything that we ask from you. And then it gets to the general stipulations, and these are just much more concrete things, and this would be where you would do all of the accounting, okay? So this means you have to give us 100,000 barrels of wheat each year, and 20,000 sheep, and we'll come on January 1st and collect some, we'll come on June 15th and collect some, okay? So these are the dates you can expect it, these are the general, the more specific stipulations. That's part 4 of this kind of contract. Okay? Then number 5 is what's called the divine witnesses. And these are where various deities are called to witness the treaty. And so the conquering state will say, hey, the great God of the Hittites says that he will watch over this covenant and make sure that you guys keep your part of the deal and that we keep our part of the deal. And then your gods will watch over it as well. And this is really a treaty or a covenant between the two gods. And they will be watching to see whether or not these things are taken care of. And so it makes it kind of a higher level kind of treaty. Okay? And then finally, the 6th section, the blessings and the cursings. Okay? And this is where, okay, if you do everything that we say, right, you give us the wheat in time, you give us the sheep in time, you don't cause any trouble, you don't make any alliances with other nations, then you're going to be blessed. And things are going to go well. We're going to treat you great. We're not going to come back and beat you up again. We're not going to take your stuff more than we have promised to. And we're going to make sure that you're safe and secure. But if you don't do what we say, if you forget to give us the money you were due, or you don't give us enough, or you start to make treaties with other people, or you start to revolt against us, then these are the things that are the terrible things that are going to happen to you, right? We're going to come and we're going to take all of your people, your richest people back with us. We're going to burn down all of your cities. We're going to kill all of your children. All of those kinds of things would be the blessings and the cursings that would be named, okay? And so, again, these documents were numerous. They found them all over the place in these Hittite sites where they were doing the excavations, all right? And then what some people started to see was there's a lot of the similarities between the book of Deuteronomy and these Hittite suzerain vassal treaties. And for a while they thought, well, Deuteronomy must have been based then on these Hittite covenants. But what's much more likely is that this was the way business was done throughout the ancient Near East in the time of Moses. That this is how nations interacted with each other and how empires interacted with smaller kingdoms. And this was the common way that people dealt with each other. You guys, what's important about that is that when God reveals himself in Scripture to us, he does it in a way that we can understand. He does it in a way that is familiar to us. Okay? And so what we see when we come to the Bible is God relating to the people at the time that he's relating to them in words and ways and forms that they can understand and appreciate. Okay? And so clearly the people of Israel were familiar with how official documents were done in their time. And God accommodates himself to those same things. And he has them write up Deuteronomy. He has Moses write this in such a way that when they read it, they'll understand their relationship with him. And so this form follows exactly the Hittite suzerain vassal treaty format. And so let's look at it really quickly. I've put this again in your notes, and I'll just show you how it breaks down, okay? Now, we can also look at Deuteronomy from a number of different standpoints. One of them that I mentioned is that it's 5 sermons that Moses preached, and you can actually see that along the way, too. Each section is introduced by Moses said these words, and then there's a sermon that follows that, okay? So that is certainly one way of looking at that, and a good way of looking at that. And actually, both can be true. This can be a suzerain vassal treaty document. It can also be 5 sermons of Moses structured in that way. Okay, so and other ways of looking at this too. But I think it's most helpful to see this kind of outline. And so let's look at it quickly here. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. This is really the preamble. And let me read it just from the beginning here. We're not going to read the whole book, obviously, but let me show you the kind of the character of how this is introduced. Chapter 1, verse 1 through 5. It says, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazaroth, and Dizahab. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him in commandment to them. After he had defeated Sihon the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and in Edrei." Okay? "Beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain this law, saying," okay? Do you see how that's very much like the narrative that we talked about? It gives the time and the place and the characters, right? It has Moses, it has Israel, it has location in the Jordan, in the wilderness. It gets very specific about where they're located. It tells us the time as well, just before they're about to enter into, it's in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month, just before they're about to enter into the promised land, okay? So all of those things, the preamble, give the context for what's happening here. Date, time, place, major people involved. This is exactly what a preamble would mean, would say in a Suzerain Hittite vassal treaty as well. Okay, second thing then is the historical prologue. And this is actually chapter 1, verse 6 through chapter 4, verse 49. And as you're reading through Deuteronomy, what you will see is that Moses and God recount for the people how they got to this point. He's going to tell them about the major events that happened to them in coming out of Egypt, and then being in the wilderness, being at Mount Sinai, and then conquering these two nations outside, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. It's going to talk a little bit about that and how there was rebellion and they refused to enter into the nation, and then how God took care of them all the way through that time and stayed with them even in their rebellion. Okay, so that's going to be the historical prologue, and it really goes through the end of chapter 4, okay? Then chapter 5 through 11 are the general stipulations. And this is the part of Deuteronomy that really is kind of the focus for us. This is where God really reveals to the people and to us the general ways by which he relates to humanity. And this is again where we get the restatement of the Ten Commandments. In fact, that's how chapter 5 starts. It reinforces and restates those big ideas that were a part of how God related to the people. And we're going to talk about chapter 6 here in a little bit. It's one of my favorite chapters maybe in the whole Bible, so we got to spend a little bit of time there. And then chapter 7, God talks about why they are God's chosen people, how he chose them, on what principle he chose them, what did he choose them for, okay? All of that is in the general stipulations, chapter 5 through 11. Then we get to the specific stipulations. And this is the one where a lot of us have difficulty. Why does God give detail after detail after detail about how they are supposed to relate to him? What are all these details, and how are they important or relevant for us today? And I think I touched on that a little bit with Leviticus and Numbers, that really they're revealing how holiness is supposed to be a part of every aspect of your life, right? That there is not a work aspect of your life and a church aspect of your life and a family aspect of your life, but that God is involved in every aspect of that, right? And how you do your day-to-day activities, from how you deal with your money to even bathroom issues are all dealt with in here. All of those things are a part of the specific stipulations, and they illustrate something about the general stipulations. In other words, there's a tie between the big picture ideas and principles and these smaller things, okay? Especially as they are practiced in the land that God is giving to them. And so you'll spend a lot of time reading that. I want you to turn quickly to the end then, in chapter 27 and 28 of Deuteronomy. Turn with me quickly here. This is something I was going to cover later, but since we are lower on time, going a little faster than I had hoped for tonight, I want to take you to chapter 28. Remember, we talked about the blessings and the cursings, okay? And this is the way that these vassal treaties, the suzerain vassal treaties, would bring about enforcement, okay? What's going to happen if you obey? What's going to happen if you disobey? And I want you to look really quickly as you get to chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, and notice even just the headline here. Before, in my Bible, of course, it's not the inspired part of the Bible. It's just a headline put in by later editors, but I can almost guarantee yours is going to say the same thing before verse 1. In bold print, mine says, blessings for obedience. Does your Bible say that there? Blessings for obedience. Okay, and God's going to list through those blessings, and they're wonderful things. There are things that God promises will happen to his people if they are obedient to him. Now, I got a question a couple of weeks ago about what exactly is blessing? How do we understand blessing today? You guys, in the Old Testament, especially in the Mosaic covenant, much more even than the Abrahamic covenant, blessing is tied to obedience. Therefore, if you are obedient, you can count on the fact that you will be successful in the way that God defines success. Now, that can happen on the individual level. That can happen on the national level as well, okay? And so sometimes, even if the nation is going the wrong way, there can be individuals who are living holy and just lives who can still expect to be blessed by God. Now, they're also going to experience some of the suffering that comes because the rest of the world and the rest of their country isn't being obedient. And you guys, that's kind of similar to what we experience in our lives today. In general, if you live the way God has called you to live, you will be successful in the way that God understands success in this life. Now, in Deuteronomy, God is actually going to tie some of those things to very specific and tangible things, even down to rainfall. If they are obedient, if they are worshiping God as they should and taking care of the poor as they should and justice is going the way that it should, then rain will come when it's supposed to, and their crops will come when they're supposed to, and even their children will be born when they're supposed to and will be safe. Okay, so God does tie specific things in Deuteronomy to obedience. And I would say that's not exactly the same today, that God defines success in some different ways than those physical blessings, perhaps, in our world. So some of those things have changed, but there's much that is similar for us as well. Okay, so my point going back to Deuteronomy 28 is to notice the length of the blessings that we have here, right? Look at how many verses are dedicated to the blessings. It starts in chapter 28, verse 1, and it goes to chapter 28, verse 14. Okay, so that would be about 14 verses. Now, I know the math gets tricky here, but 1 through 14 would be about 14 verses. Now, look at the curses for disobedience. You see where that starts? Chapter 28, verse 15. Now, turn in your Bible until you find the end of those. Where is it? It's actually at the end of chapter 28. Right there, the next section starts in chapter 29. Okay, so now we have chapter 28, 15 through 28, 68. Okay? How many verses is that? Are you doing the math at home? 15 through 68, be about 53, 54 verses if you count inclusive there, right? So is 53 greater or less than 15 or 14? Right? It's greater by quite a bit, more than 3 times. Okay, so I often want to ask you the question, why does God spend so much more time detailing for them the curses for disobedience than he does the blessings for obedience? I'd give you a couple of reasons for that. The first one I would say is because the curses for disobedience is what they're actually much more likely to experience. Because they are much more likely to be disobedient and unfaithful to God and thus bring about on themselves these curses. But the second thing is that I think God is using a very wise principle that is still used even to this day. Something called the carrot and the stick. 2 different ways of motivation, right? You can do it by positive motivation, the carrot that keeps people going in the right direction. But oftentimes people actually respond better to the threat of punishment for disobedience. And so God is giving them a very vivid picture of what they can expect. In fact, it will turn your stomach to read this chapter. And now some of you teenagers at home are going, oh good, I can't wait to read the end of that. And others are saying, wow, I don't really want to read the end of that. I understand. But it's very vivid and disturbing detail about what's going to happen to them when they disobey. And God does that because he doesn't want them to look back someday in the future, and it's actually going to be hundreds of years in the future, and say to him, you never told us what was going to happen to us if we were disobedient. When all of these things actually do come upon them in the exact detail that God describes for them, God will be able to say, and he won't say it in these words, but he will be able to say, I told you so. That this is what I didn't want for you to have, and yet it's what you went towards, and now you're going to see it played out in your life in exquisite and terrible detail. And so God gives those for them so that they will understand which way not to go. All right, now I want to take you to the 6th part that parallels the Suzerain and Vassal Treaty, and that is the witnesses. And we've talked about this since day 1 and day 2 of this class. In Genesis chapter 1, I told you in verse 1 that the covenant witnesses were introduced, right? That God said in the beginning, He created the heavens and the earth. And these will be the covenant witnesses. And I want to show you how that comes about. So chapter 30, verse 19. Look at this. It says, very famous verse, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Now, look at this, by the way. God says, therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live. Now, the choice should be obvious, right? Choose life. Of course, that's what you're going to want. You're going to want the blessing and the life. And yet God urges that same thing because He knows that unfortunately many are going to choose death and cursing instead. But look at the covenant witnesses. He says, heaven and earth are there to witness against you today. And I've made the point before earlier in earlier weeks, but where can you go to escape from the heavens and the earth? There is nowhere, right? God is saying that absolutely everywhere that mankind goes, the witnesses will be there to see what happens. And so if it takes 2 or 3 witnesses to speak against us, to make the case for our condemnation and for receiving those curses that God has promised in case of disobedience, then they are there and ever present, ever seeing what we can do. There will be no one who can say, well, I didn't do such and such, because the heavens and the earth will be there to witness. And by the way, God will be too. Okay, so those witnesses are listed several times for us in those last chapters as part of the last part of the Suzerain vassal treaty. All right, I want to get to some highlights from this book, and I'm going to go fast through this. Please write down these references and turn with me if you get a chance to in Scripture, but I want to read some very key points of this because I want you to discern tone. What do I mean by tone? It's not just the words that God is saying, but the emotion that He attaches to those words. Because I think we get into a rut of reading the Bible in kind of a monotone. Reading it to ourselves that way, or either out loud or just in your head as you're reading. You kind of just, drone through it a bit. And maybe it's time to pick up a dramatic reading of the book of Deuteronomy somewhere, or something that adds a little bit of excitement and emotion to the reading of these words. Because I think if you read carefully, what you'll find in Deuteronomy is that it's unavoidable how God feels here. You can't really ignore it. The key word, the most used word, I think, I haven't counted actually in here, but one of the key concepts for the book of Deuteronomy is love. And that is completely surprising and shocking to most people. When they think about Deuteronomy, they don't think about love. But that's exactly what this book talks about. Why? Because it's actually a book about grace. Now, we think about, I've heard it a lot of times, the Old Testament is about law, the New Testament is about grace. You guys, I think that's a total misunderstanding, though. The New Testament has very much to give us in terms of instruction, which is what the word Torah or law actually should be translated for us as. It's instruction. It's a father giving to his son the instruction that's going to make him successful in this world. It's letting him know so he doesn't have to find out for himself what mistakes are out there or what good patterns there are out there to follow. How to be successful in this world in God's eyes. And so it's a loving father here in both Moses and in God who is giving this instruction to the people. And by the way, the New Testament has a lot to say about that kind of instruction too. The Old Testament has much about grace, though, and I want you to see that as we read through these sections, too. So let me get you started on that grace in chapter 4, verses 32 to 40. Okay, so write that reference down. Come back to it when you get a chance. I'm reading here Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 32 to 40. And this is what God says. For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard, and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Has any God ever done that for anybody before, he asks? To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. There is no one besides him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might discipline you. And on earth he let you see his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them and brought you out of Egypt with his own presence by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in to give you the land for an inheritance as it is this day. Know therefore today and lay it to your hearts that the Lord is God in heaven and above and on the earth beneath. There is no other. Did you catch that? It was because he loved your fathers. The motivating thing for God in the Exodus and in giving the law of Deuteronomy is love for them. Turn now to chapter 6. This one is dangerous for me. I've preached on this numerous times. It is, I think, maybe my favorite chapter in all of Scripture. And I want to take you to it briefly, if I can possibly, because there's some other things I want you to get to here. But let me read a section or two of this chapter 6, because it's key to understanding Deuteronomy. Beginning in verse 1 of Deuteronomy 6. Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's sons, by keeping all his statutes and commandments. Did you catch that? The way that you fear the Lord your God is by keeping all of his statutes and his commandments. The fear of the Lord and obedience to the Lord are absolutely the same thing here, which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you. What does God want for them? He wants it to go well with them, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey, right? That's what God wants for his people. Now, the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. This is what's known as the Shema. It's also known as what I would call the John 3:16. This is the one that was most memorized by all of the little kids in the Old Testament. When they would go to Awana, they would get candy, and they would get presents for learning these verses. These are the verses that are said every morning and every evening to this day in Jewish households who are observant. This is the Shema, the John 3:16, I would say, of the Old Testament. Here it is. It's Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your hearts. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Have any of you ever been to a Jewish house and seen on their gates a little box, and then on the door frame, as you're going through their front door, another little box? Those little boxes contain these words, and they are taking very literally what it says here, that these things will be physically on their doorposts. Now, that's what God is talking about. Certainly he wants them to think about them physically, but more importantly, he wants it where? It says, on their heart, okay? If love is one of the central pieces of the book of Deuteronomy, the other one is heart. And obviously those two things are connected, right? You love with your heart. Your heart is the seat of your emotions and your will, according to how Scripture understands that. And so all of these things, all of this obedience is to flow out of the heart. Why? Because God first loved you, and he brought you up out of slavery in Egypt to show his great love for you, that you would love him in return from your heart. And that is the basis of everything that happens here in Deuteronomy. If they do everything that's written in here to the letter without a heart of obedience to him, they have not kept the law. That would be strict legalism without any kind of value whatsoever in God's eyes. But if they have a heart, even that might break some of these commandments across time, there is always room and way for reconciliation to come about. And so God looks at that heart first. Without the heart, obedience means nothing. With the heart, obedience is only a reaction to God's initial love to him, and a just reaction to it. In fact, let me take you to the end of this chapter, in chapter 6, beginning in verse 20. Again, I love this verse. I hate to take such a little time on it tonight, but this is what we're going to do. I think you can find a sermon of mine somewhere that will talk about this online if you look hard enough for it. But Deuteronomy 6, verse 20. When your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you, then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. You guys, do you think the Exodus is important to an understanding of Israel for themselves? Absolutely. It's stated over and over again, even here in Deuteronomy again. Verse 23. And he brought us out from there, that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. So he had something wonderful in store for them. 24. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, again, to fear the Lord our God. Okay, so fear and obedience are linked, for our good always, right? If we keep these commandments, it will be for our good. We will be blessed, and we will live long lives, and everything will be great in terms of God's eyes for success for us, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day. Verse 25. And it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God as he has commanded us. So you think, okay, wait a second. What is righteousness, right? In the New Testament, we understand righteousness to be something that is imputed to us, given to us by God, and certainly that is true. Without God's imputation of righteousness for us, we have no standing before him. We have no opportunity to enter into his presence. But there's also a righteousness that comes about as part of our sanctification, as part of becoming more holy, as living holy lives on this earth, certainly, but also preparing for a holiness in the presence of an almighty, holy God for all of eternity. Okay? And so part of our ability to be righteous in that sense comes from our obedience to him. That righteousness, from our point of view, involves our obedience to him out of a love and response to the fact that he brought us out of slavery. Now you might say, I was never a slave in Egypt. I don't even know what that means. But the New Testament tells us we were slaves to something even worse. We were slaves to death and sin. And God brought us out of that kingdom of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, that we might be witnesses to all of the world around us of his great and wonderful mercy. Okay? And so there's a response that is a natural, righteous response from us when we realize what God has done for us. It is righteous and holy living as a response to him. All right, I was going to take you to chapter 8, but don't have time for that. So let's go to chapter 9, verse 6 real quick. Write this reference down. Chapter 9, verse 6 says this briefly. Now know therefore that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. Okay, there's that declarative righteousness again. It's not because they were already righteous. God gives it to them, knowing that they are already a stubborn people, and that their response then is righteousness to him. They are no better than anybody else. They are just chosen and called by him. Does that sound familiar to you? Does that describe our situation as well and our hearts as well? Go to chapter 10. Can't miss this. This is chapter 10, verses 12 to 22. This is so important. I know I'm skipping around, but I want to highlight this for you. Chapter 10, verses 12 to 22. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples as you are this day. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart and be no longer stubborn. Is God about the circumcision outwardly? No, it's about the heart. Even back here in Deuteronomy, you guys. He's talking about, okay, if you've got outward circumcision, it's of some value, but very little as compared with that circumcision of the heart. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. You can't fool him by trying to bring an offering that isn't worthy, that's coming out of a heart that isn't dedicated to him. You're not going to fool him because he sees the heart. And so you're not going to bribe him by giving him something like that. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve him and hold fast to him, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise. He is your God, who has done for you all these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. You see fulfilled promises there? All right, go to chapter 11, verses 8 to 12 quickly. You shall therefore keep the commandment that I command you today, that you may be strong and go in and take possession of the land that you are going over to possess, that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their offspring, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land you are entering to take possession of is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and irrigated it like a garden of vegetables. But the land that you are going over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water by the rain from heaven, a land that the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Okay, that's again talking about the difference in terms of the hills and the valleys in that promised land and how that's different from Egypt. All right, some of the other highlights we've already seen. I took you to chapters 28 and 30 through 11 and 20. So we've kind of hit those highlights already. Let me talk about some things of significance, things to look for as you read. And we just talked about a couple of those. First of all, the love of God, the heart of God. Those are the tone of this book, that God loves, that his heart is for his people, and that he wants his people to have a heart for him as well. And so we often think about the Old Testament, people falling into legalism. And really, that is a part of what happened. But the bigger part was that they just lost a heart for God. And you guys, I think we can always be in danger of that ourselves as well. That we can go about doing the things that we know to be right and lose an understanding, a relationship of God through love in our hearts as well. Another big theme then of this book is God's land, that this belongs to him, and he gives it to whomever he wants to. That the people of Israel don't have a right to it. Even though God has promised it to them, he can still take it away from them, at least temporarily, and give it back to them if and when he chooses to, dependent on their obedience and their heart state. We talked about instruction and obedience, about rewards and consequences, about blessings and cursings. Another big thing for significance in this one is do not be afraid, right? Again, we talked about the fact that they're about to move into a land. They have right to be afraid of the unknown as they head in. And yet God is saying, don't be afraid because I am with you. And so he will go with them and be their rock and their stability. The final one that I want to talk about in terms of things of significance is faithfulness in a historically measurable sense. In other words, God is writing down and will write down their history. And we're going to see that in Joshua and in Judges and in all the books of Kings and Samuel and Chronicles. And we're going to see that this history is written down and constantly brought back into comparison with the book of Deuteronomy. And so the people's faithfulness or lack thereof will be on display. And it will be written down for people to read for generations and even thousands of years to come as we are reading today. And so history, Israel's history, is a record of their faithfulness or faithlessness in different parts of their lives in the land. I'm going to skip down here. I have a couple of quotes for you, I think, that are written in your notes, but I want to skip down to some links to the New Testament. And the one that I want to take you to is actually from the sermon from this weekend. If you are at Grace Chapel, if you weren't, you can go and listen to it from, it would have been October 4th of 2020. You can find the sermon. It was on the parable of the Good Samaritan, coming from Luke chapter 10. And I take you there because I think it was a really good answer to a question that I get a lot as a pastor and especially an enthusiast of the Old Testament. And it's one that I even got in writing in an email this week. And the question can be phrased a lot of different ways, but generally what is meant by it is, what is a Christian's relationship to the law? Why do we not do all that is said in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? And I gave you a little bit of a piece of that when I talked about the context of it, right? That there's much of this law that is specific to how they're supposed to behave in the land. They're supposed to demonstrate to the nations around them how they are different, and that will cause them to be conspicuous among their neighbors. And their neighbors are then going to ask them questions about who they are or whose they are. Because I think there's nothing different about our calling in this world as well. That we are called to be different as well. and that our neighbors should be watching to see why we're different and should ask us questions about that difference. And so Jesus was approached with that same thing as a rabbi, as a teacher, and certainly as one who is concerned and connected with the law. And this happens in Luke chapter 10. Again, if you were in service this weekend, you caught it. I'm going to take just a little bit of a tack, a little bit different, but similar to what Chris did as well. So Luke chapter 10, verse 25 says, "Behold, the lawyer stood up to put him to the test, to put Jesus to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' Jesus said to him, 'What is written in the law? How do you read it?' And he answered, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.'" What is he quoting there? It's Deuteronomy, right? We just read it. And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Okay, that's good. But then the question comes, right, that brings about the parable. "But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" And at this point, really, the heart of the man is revealed. Whether he knows it or not, his heart is being revealed here. Because the extent of his question really is, who do I have to love? Where do I get to stop? What is the limits of the love that I have to have? Who is my neighbor? So that I can do that for them and nobody else, right? So I won't put myself out there any more than that. And of course, you know that the parable ends with Jesus asking the question backwards. Who then was a neighbor to this man? And this is verse 36. "Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" And the lawyer answered, he said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." And so the question really isn't, who is my neighbor, but who was a neighbor, or who should I be, how should I be a neighbor to somebody else? Right? And so it's not asking about the limitations of my neighborliness or my mercy. It's a heart that looks to be merciful and neighborly to everybody they come in contact with. And that's exactly what Jesus wants this person to see. The person who is in need of help here is actually the one asking the question, and Jesus points the question back at his heart. Have a heart that is after God, and then all other things fall into place in terms of the law. And that's really the link to the New Testament. There are many others. I encourage you to write down Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 22, and go and look at that when you get a chance to. Write down also Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. Write down also 1 Corinthians 9, verses 9 to 11, and Ephesians 6, verse 1 to 3. And Romans 10, verses 5 to 10. I know I gave you a lot of them there. You probably have to go back and rewind and write those down, but I'd like you to look at those as links to the New Testament as well. You guys, now we come to our quiz. I know I'm out of time. I'm stretching your limits to endure tonight, but I can't really let you go without giving you a quiz, and so I'm going to put that up for you here. If I can get my technology to work here correctly. And our quiz number, James is going to put up on the screen for you as I'm getting it ready. Oh, and I'm going to have to, okay. I'm finding it here in the right place too. So the quiz number, did you put it up there for him, James? Did you find it? Menti quiz then is, the number is 84 41 31 1. Again, if you're new with us, then you go to menti.com. You have to be doing this if you're doing it live. Otherwise, it's not going to work if you're watching me at a later time. But let's run through that then. Here's the quiz. First question is a review question. The first few questions here are a review. Where is the Abrahamic covenant first found in Scripture? This is one you ought to be able to say frontwards and backwards in your sleep. And again, I'll try to find you on campus here somewhere or somewhere else in the world, and I'll ask you this question, and your answer to me should be, I'll let a few more people get in. I know we're a little late getting you the code. So the answer to where to find the first occurrence of the Abrahamic covenant is in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. That's Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And the three elements then of we're going to get to it. Which of these is not an element of the Abrahamic covenant? Is it crown, nation, land, or blessing? Which of these is not an element of the Abrahamic covenant? Crown, nation, land, or blessing? Again, this should be fairly automatic for you, I hope, at this point. So the Abrahamic covenant, those three elements that are found in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, those are the land, nation, and blessing. Which of those is the most central? You're right, it is blessing. Okay, I gotta get my Declaration of Independence back in its very secure holding thing so I can hide it in my office from Nicolas Cage. Yes, it was crown. It was not a part of the Abrahamic covenant. That is something that will be talked about a little bit with David, something similar to that in the Davidic covenant, but not here in the Abrahamic covenant. Another review question for you. Leviticus emphasizes that Israel is just one nation out of many. Moses is a very humble man. The journey from Egypt to Israel was difficult. Or holiness is to be reflected in every aspect of life. So 4 different possibilities there. Leviticus emphasizes that A, Israel is just one nation out of many. B, Moses is a very humble man. C, the journey from Egypt to Israel was very difficult. Or D, holiness is to be reflected in every aspect of life. Wonderful job on the quiz tonight, you guys. You're all getting it right, as James did actually in our pre-quiz tonight as well. He got 90-something%. He only missed one question. I won't tell you which one that is. Next question then. Which of these books does not move the action of the historical story forward? Another review question for us. Was it Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers? Which of these books does not move the action of the historical story forward? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers? Give you a chance to answer that one before I blow the answer. Yeah, and by the way, I noticed that a lot of the other programs that we have, they give prizes for answering these questions correctly. I guess we got to think about some prizes in the future here. What do you think, James? That sound good? Bailey left some white chocolate Reese's peanut butter cups here. She said she doesn't like white chocolate, so if you come and knock on the door in the next 2 minutes, I will give you one. I'm not hearing any knocking. People are too far away. It was Leviticus. Does not move the action of the historical story forward. So well done. Next question. Here's one from tonight, actually. I'll read this one carefully. Deuteronomy can be seen as organized according to a suzerain vassal treaty format. B, a series of farewell sermons from Moses. C, chronology. Or D, A and B are true. Was it a suzerain vassal treaty format, a series of farewell sermons from Moses, chronology, or A and B are both true? For Deuteronomy can be seen as organized according to. By the way, what did you think of that suzerain vassal treaty? Is that an interesting way of looking at it? I think it's really, really helpful. Yeah, and I think it just puts it really in a good context for us. You guys, I'm not sure that it was the Hittites that came up with that. I think that was just a normal kind of method for people in the ancient Near East for writing these things. We just happen to have a lot of them found in the Hittite archaeological evidence now. All right, next question. Deuteronomy was compared in class to which of these famous documents? Was it the Magna Carta, the Code of Hammurabi, the Constitution of the United States, or the Communist Manifesto? Well, see, one of these we could have used. Actually, maybe 2 of the other ones we could have used, but we didn't in class. We talked about one in particular. The Code of Hammurabi is actually often compared to the law of Moses, but not here in our class. We compared it to the Constitution of the United States, right? It's the measuring rod. And again, as we go back, as we make laws today, even as we talk about it politically today, right? We say, is this constitutional or not constitutional? So it's a document that's had a lot of power for us to determine ourselves and to govern ourselves over time, right? This is an unconstitutional law. Well, then let's get rid of it if it's not according to our Constitution. That's exactly what's happening with Deuteronomy 2. This is unconstitutional, what we're doing as a nation, and we need to repent of it and go a different direction. So you're right, it is the Constitution of the United States. I hope that I answered this one in class. I think I did, yes. Pretty briefly. Deuteronomy 6:4-5 was called what in class? Was it called the Shema, the Tabernacle, the John 3:16 of the Old Testament, or A and C are true? I see some of you jump in there and you answer one and then you read all the way to the end and then you change your answer. So good job. The Deuteronomy 6:4 was called what in class? Was it the Shema, A, B, the Tabernacle, C, the John 3:16 of the Old Testament, or D, A and C are true? And what James has learned with all of my questions, if there's one that says A and C are true, that's going to be the right answer. I don't think he even read all the rest of the answers to this question. He saw that there was one that said A and C, and he said, I'm just picking that one. And he was right. It is A and C are true. It is the Shema, because it starts with that word in Hebrew, hear, which is Shema. And it also is the John 3:16 of the Old Testament, as I call it. I don't know if anybody else calls it that, but it is the kind of the central one. It's the one that everybody in a Jewish circle would certainly say is the central core verse of the Old Testament. You'll notice that before the parable of the Good Samaritan, that's what was quoted by this teacher of the law too, right? It's Deuteronomy 6:4-5. All right, according to the discussion in class, which of the following is not true? Okay, read carefully again. According to the discussion in class, which of the following is not true? A, the Mosaic covenant is wider in application than the Abrahamic covenant. B, the word Torah is best understood as instruction. C, the title Deuteronomy is a late addition to this book. Or D, grace is found in both the Old and New Testaments. I thought this was going to be a harder question, but it looks like most of you are getting it right. So you are great students, and I appreciate your hanging in there. By the way, I just want to commend you for making it halfway through the class. You guys, I know that there can be temptations to drop out. I hope that you will continue going. I know that the reading is a lot. I know that you might be overwhelmed with that and the other readings that are going on here in the church. I just encourage you to keep it up. And even if you've got to take a break and remember that these are recorded, it is better to stay on track, because I do find that people, once they kind of get off track, it's hard to get back on. But I do encourage you to stick with it, and I thank you for doing that so far. So yes, the correct answer was the Mosaic covenant is wider in application than the Abrahamic covenant. It is actually opposite of that. The Abrahamic covenant is wider in application, right? Because it goes to all the peoples of the earth, whereas the Mosaic covenant has some specific and pointed application to the people as they're living in the land, okay? Now, of course, there are bigger principles behind that. Oh man, so much more could be talked about with that. Remember, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, do not murder. But I say to you that anyone who anyone who hates his brother has already committed murder in his heart. And so it's all about the heart, and Jesus is all about that too. But so those are principles that are still New Testament principles for us, because they were before the law as well. It didn't, like I said, murder didn't become against God's law when it was written down by Moses. It had been for hundreds of years before that, and it remains so today, even if other parts of this aren't applicable to us in the same way. And so much more could be said about that. But we're out of time for tonight. That is all for the Menti quiz too. Thanks for hanging in there for an extra 9 minutes. God bless, and we'll see you back here, Lord willing, next week as we go into Joshua. Bye now.